Commander stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the blue-green world of New Appalachia grow larger on the screen. Behind his ship, 300 warships of the Collective filled the space above the human colony. The sight should have made any species surrender immediately. Had conquered 17 star systems in 3 years. His method was simple and effective. First, his ships would appear in overwhelming numbers. Second, his psychological warfare team would broadcast images of what happened to species who resisted. Third, the enemy would realize they had no chance and surrender. It worked every time. The humans had studied war for thousands of years, but they had never faced anything like the Collective. Its intelligence officers had spent months analyzing human behavior. Their report was clear. Humans feared death. They valued survival. When facing impossible odds, their military doctrine said to retreat and regroup. Everything pointed to a quick surrender. New Appalachia was a farming colony with 60,000 people. They had 2 old frigates for defense and a garrison of 5,000 soldiers. Against 300 warships and an invasion force of 200,000 troops, they had no chance. The math was simple. Expected this to be over by sunset. His communications officer activated the psychological bombardment. Screens all over the colony lit up with images of burning worlds, defeated armies, and the overwhelming power of the fleet. The message was clear in every human language. Surrender now and live. Fight and die. You cannot win. Resistance is pointless. Watch the colony's communication channels, waiting for the inevitable response. Minutes passed. Then something strange happened. Music started playing from the human military positions. Not screams of terror or desperate pleas for mercy. Music. At first thought it was some kind of malfunction, but the music grew louder. The human soldiers were singing. His translator struggled to process the words, but the melody was strong and steady. The humans called it Battle Hymn of the Republic. More voices joined in. Thousands of human soldiers were singing together. The psychological warfare team checked their equipment. This wasn't supposed to happen. Fear should have paralyzed the humans by now. Instead, more songs started. Something called Scotland the Brave echoed across the communication channels. Then songs in other human languages. Chinese, Arabic, Spanish, Swahili. The colony was filling with music. A tactical officer spoke up. Commander, the human garrison is moving into the open. They're forming ranks outside their defensive positions. That made no sense. Leaving fortified positions when facing invasion was suicide. Pulled up the visual feeds from the advanced scouts. 5,000 human soldiers stood in formation on open ground. They weren't running. They weren't hiding. They were standing together, weapons ready, and they were singing. The first wave descended toward the landing zones. Standard procedure called for landing in 6 locations simultaneously, overwhelming the defenders with numbers and firepower. Each landing zone could accommodate 10,000 troops. With 50,000 soldiers in the first wave, the humans would be crushed in minutes. The touchdown, ramps extended. Soldiers poured out in perfect formation, weapons charging, ready to sweep away any resistance. They were stronger than humans, better armed, and vastly more numerous. Victory was certain. Then the humans charged. 5,000 voices rose in song as the human soldiers ran toward landing zones designed for 10 times their numbers. They weren't running away. They were running toward the enemy, and they never stopped singing. Watched in confusion as his front lines buckled. The humans crashed into formations like a hammer. They were outnumbered 10 to 1 at each landing zone, but they fought like each soldier was worth 100. When one human fell, 3 others would step forward, singing louder. When a position seemed lost, another song would start and the humans would push harder. The soldiers were trained for rational combat. They expected enemies to break when facing superior numbers. They expected fear to slow their opponents down. But these humans weren't slowing down. They were accelerating, and they were singing. A group of 200 humans surrounded by 1,000 troops didn't surrender. Instead, they started singing something their translator identified as a Maori war chant. The sound was deep and powerful, more like thunder than music. Those 200 humans fought until only 10 remained, and those 10 were still singing when reinforcements arrived. Second-in-command turned to him. "Commander, our troops are requesting support. They report that the humans are exhibiting behavior inconsistent with our psychological profile. The singing appears to eliminate fear response. When humans sing together, their courage increases rather than decreases under pressure." That was impossible. Fear was universal. All species felt it. It was a survival mechanism. But the evidence was on every screen. Humans dragging wounded comrades forward while never missing a note of their songs. Humans forming shield walls and singing in perfect harmony while holding against charges. Humans dying with songs on their lips, and somehow that made the others fight harder. The Psychological Warfare Division frantically updated their models. This wasn't berserker rage. The humans were thinking clearly, making tactical decisions, coordinating their attacks. But they were also singing, and the singing was doing something they had never encountered. It was making courage contagious. By nightfall, had lost 12,000 troops. The humans had lost 800. The mathematics made no sense. His forces had overwhelming superiority in every category except one. The humans had something that couldn't be measured or countered. They had songs that turned individuals into something greater than the sum of their parts. The second day was worse. Committed another wave of troops, certain that exhaustion would finally break the human defenders. Instead, the humans sang through the night, rotating their soldiers while keeping the music constant. When dawn came, fresh human troops took the line, and the singing never stopped. The soldiers began to hesitate. They had never faced an enemy that grew stronger as the battle continued. They had never heard dying opponents laugh and sing. One unit broke when a group of 30 humans, surrounded and dying, started singing something called the Marines' Hymn, and charged into a force of 300. Those 30 humans died, but they took 200 with them, and their song echoed across the battlefield long after they fell. On the third day, received word that human reinforcements were approaching. 7 warships from Earth were entering the system. 7 ships against 300 should have meant nothing, but troops on the ground were demoralized, confused, and scared. They had broken against an enemy that should have been broken days ago. They had learned something terrifying. These humans could not be defeated by numbers alone. The 7 human warships broadcast a message as they approached. It wasn't a threat or a demand for surrender. It was music. The same battle hymns that the soldiers on New Appalachia had been singing, now played across every frequency in the system. Thousands of voices, recorded from the battlefield, singing in defiance of death itself. Made his decision. He ordered the retreat. His officers stared at him in shock. The collective had never retreated, but understood what they were facing now. This wasn't a battle that could be won with ships and soldiers. The humans had found something that turned mathematics and logic into dust. They had learned to weaponize hope itself. As the fleet from New Appalachia sent a message to the collective's high command, it was short and direct. Species classification update required. Humans exhibit irrational courage amplification through synchronized vocalization. Recommend immediate reclassification to threat level Omega. These beings teach each other to laugh at death. We cannot defeat them. The human soldiers on New Appalachia watched the alien armada retreat. They were exhausted, bloodied, and far fewer than when the battle started. But they were still singing. And across human space, the word began to spread. Humanity had found a way to turn ancient songs into weapons that no armor could stop and no calculation could predict. The galaxy was about to learn what 5,000 humans already knew. When you sing together in the face of death, you stop being afraid. You become part of something that cannot be killed. You become the song itself, and the song never dies. Within weeks, Every species in the galaxy had heard about the Battle of New Appalachia. The story spread through official channels and unofficial whispers. 5,000 humans had held against 200,000 troops. They had done it by singing. The concept seemed absurd until the combat footage started circulating. The collective tried to suppress the information, but it was too late. Other species under rule saw the footage and asked questions. Questions like, did our ancestors sing before battle? And what happened to our war songs? They were the first to remember. They had been conquered by the 40 years ago, and an entire generation had grown up under occupation. But the elders remembered the death chants, songs their warriors sang before facing impossible odds. The chants had been banned, classified as dangerous cultural remnants that promoted irrational resistance. A historian named Aura began researching her people's forbidden past. She found recordings hidden in old archives, songs from before the conquest. She listened to them alone in her quarters, afraid of what might happen if she was caught. The songs spoke of courage, sacrifice, and defiance. They spoke of warriors who sang together and became unstoppable. Aura made a choice. She the recordings and sent them to resistance cells across space. Within days, the old songs were being sung in secret meetings. Within weeks, they were being sung openly in the streets. The garrison tried to shut it down, but how do you arrest an entire population for singing? The remembered next. They were in species who communicated partially through rhythmic vibrations. Before the conquered them, warriors had performed synchronized ceremonies that united their swarm minds into collective purpose. They had banned the ceremonies, calling them primitive and inefficient. But now they were remembering why their ancestors had valued them. Humanity watched these developments with interest. The human government received hundreds of requests from species across the galaxy. They all wanted the same thing. They wanted to understand how the battle hymns worked. They wanted to learn what had made 5,000 humans capable of the impossible. Dr. Sarah was selected to lead humanity's response. She was an anthropologist who specialized in military culture and group psychology. She understood that what happened on New Appalachia wasn't magic. It was something deeply human, something ancient that modern warfare had almost forgotten. She stood before the Galactic Council and explained, when humans sing together before battle, several things happen. First, the rhythm synchronizes our breathing and heart rates. We become physically coordinated without conscious effort. Second, the shared melody creates emotional resonance. One person's courage amplifies another's. Third, the lyrics remind us why we fight. We stop being afraid of dying because we're focused on what we're fighting for. From the Confederation interrupted. But this is irrational. Fear keeps soldiers alive. It makes them cautious. It makes them survive. Sarah nodded. Yes, fear helps individuals survive. But sometimes survival isn't the goal. Sometimes the goal is to hold a position, to buy time, to protect something more important than your own life. In those moments, fear becomes a liability. The humans on New Appalachia didn't need to survive. They needed to hold until reinforcements arrived. The songs let them do that. Another spoke up. Are you saying this technique only works for humans? Sarah smiled. No, I'm saying humans remembered something that most species forgot. Your ancestors probably had similar practices. War songs, battle chants, ceremonial dances, things that united individuals into groups with shared purpose. They conquered you by taking those practices away. They made you forget how to be brave together. The chamber fell silent. Species looked at each other, understanding dawning. They hadn't just conquered with superior technology and numbers. They had conquered by isolating individuals, making each soldier face death alone. They had turned warfare into a calculation where numbers always won. But the humans had broken the calculation. They had shown that courage wasn't just individual determination. It could be shared, amplified, and made contagious through simple acts like singing together. Over the following months, humanity shared its battle hymns freely. Human military advisors taught alien species the principles behind effective war songs. The melody had to be strong enough to be heard over combat noise. The rhythm had to be simple enough that wounded soldiers could maintain it. The lyrics had to mean something worth dying for. But humanity also encouraged species to rediscover their own traditions. The death chants were different from human hymns but equally powerful. The vibrational ceremonies created a different kind of unity, but the result was the same. Species across the galaxy were remembering that they had once known how to face death together. The collective watched these developments with growing alarm. Their intelligence division prepared reports about the spread of what they called synchronized courage amplification. The reports were unanimous in their assessment. This was a threat greater than any weapon technology. This was a threat to the fundamental logic that made conquest possible. General, the supreme commander of military forces, read the reports with disgust. He had spent his entire career perfecting the mathematics of warfare. His strategies were based on calculations of force ratios, supply lines, and morale degradation. Everything was measured and predicted. But now his enemies were using something that couldn't be measured. They were using hope. He called a meeting of his top commanders. "We cannot allow this to spread further. The humans have introduced a destabilizing element into galactic warfare. Species who should surrender are now fighting. Species who should fear us are now singing. This ends now." One of his commanders asked the obvious question, "How do we stop singing?" Had an answer. "We show them that singing doesn't make them bulletproof. We find a human colony and we crush it so thoroughly that no one will ever sing in battle again. We make an example that the entire galaxy will remember." The target was selected carefully. New Harmony was a human colony with 80,000 people. It had a garrison of 7,000 soldiers and minimal orbital defenses. It was also located near the territories of 6 species that had recently started reviving their own war songs. Crushing New Harmony would send a clear message. General assembled an armada of 500 warships. This time, there would be no gradual escalation. The first strike would be overwhelming. Orbital bombardment would destroy the colony's defenses in minutes. The ground assault would follow with 300,000 troops. The human garrison wouldn't have time to sing a single note before they were annihilated. News of the fleet's movement spread quickly. The human government sent urgent messages to New Harmony telling them to evacuate, but the colonists voted to stay. The garrison commander, Colonel James, sent a simple reply to Earth. "We heard what happened on New Appalachia. We know what to do." When the armada arrived at New Harmony, they found the colony's population standing in the streets. Men, women, and children. 80,000 people who should have been fleeing or hiding. They were standing together and they were singing. The garrison of 7,000 soldiers stood at the front, weapons ready. Behind them, 73,000 civilians sang support. The songs echoed across every communication channel. Amazing Grace mixed with We Shall Overcome. The battle hymn of the Republic blended with songs in every human language. The colony became a chorus that filled the space around the planet. General ordered the orbital bombardment. His ships opened fire. Kinetic strikes and energy weapons hammered the colony's shields. The shields collapsed in seconds, just as predicted. But the singing didn't stop. Even as the bombardment tore into buildings and defensive positions, the humans kept singing. The ground assault began. 300,000 troops landed in overwhelming force. They should have swept through the defenders in minutes, but something was different this time. The humans weren't just soldiers singing. Entire families were singing together. Children sang with parents. The elderly sang with the young. The colony had become one voice, and that voice was unbreakable. Colonel stood with his soldiers at the front line. He was 60 years old and had fought in 3 wars. He had seen courage before, but he had never seen anything like this. His soldiers weren't just fighting for the colony. They were fighting for the idea that singing together could overcome anything. They were fighting to prove that New Appalachia wasn't a fluke. The battle raged for hours. The troops pushed forward, their numbers grinding down the defenders. But the humans wouldn't break. Every position that fell was retaken. Every soldier that died was replaced by a civilian who picked up their weapon and kept singing. The mathematics said the colony should have fallen in 30 minutes. Instead, it held for 6 hours. Then the reinforcements arrived. Not from Earth, from everywhere. Ships singing their death chants. Swarm ships vibrating their war ceremonies. Ships from 40 different species, all broadcasting their own versions of the battle hymns they had rediscovered. 200 ships against 500 warships, but every ship was crewed by beings who had learned to sing their courage together. General stared at the tactical display in disbelief. His 500 warships outnumbered the enemy fleet more than 2 to 1. His 300,000 ground troops were still pushing forward against the human defenders. By every calculation, he should be winning. Instead, his forces were faltering. The problem wasn't military. It was psychological. His soldiers on the ground were fighting an enemy that refused to stop singing even while dying. His ship crews were listening to 40 different species broadcasting war songs on every frequency. They had trained for battle against rational opponents. They had no training for this. A cruiser broadcast its death chant as it rammed into a battleship. Both ships exploded, but the chant continued on other frequencies, taken up by other vessels. A squadron of fighters performed a synchronized attack pattern that matched the rhythm of their war ceremony, making their movements impossible to predict. Human ships played every battle hymn in their archives simultaneously, creating a wall of sound that drowned out communications. On the ground, Colonel's garrison was down to 3,000 effectives. The rest were dead or wounded, but the civilians had taken up weapons and they were still singing. 73,000 voices raised in defiance of mathematics and logic. The troops kept advancing, kept killing, but they couldn't break the song. Received reports from his ground commanders. The reports all said the same thing. Our troops are losing cohesion. The enemy's courage is affecting our morale. Soldiers are questioning why we're fighting beings who face death singing. Request guidance. For the first time in his career, didn't have guidance to give. His entire strategic philosophy was based on breaking enemy morale through superior force. But these enemies weren't breaking. They were teaching each other to be unbreakable, and they were doing it with songs. A message came through from the Allied fleet. It was from Admiral Way of the Earth Defense Force. The message was simple. General, you can kill every human on New Harmony. You can destroy every ship we brought here, but you can't kill what we've learned. 40 species are singing now. Next month it'll be 80. Next year it'll be every species in the galaxy except yours. You can't win this war because we're not fighting for territory anymore. We're fighting for the right to face death on our own terms. Looked at the battlefield displays. He could still win here. His forces still had numerical superiority. He could grind down the defenders through sheer attrition. But then what? He would have won one battle while losing the war, because Admiral was right. The singing was spreading faster than fleets could move. For every colony they crushed, 10 more would learn the songs. For every species they silenced, 20 more would remember their ancient war chants. The collective had conquered 17 star systems by teaching species to fear overwhelming force. Now humanity was teaching those same species that overwhelming force didn't matter if you faced it together, singing. The calculation had inverted. They had become the ones who were afraid. General gave the order he never thought he would give. All forces cease fire and withdraw, return to space. His commanders protested. Victory was still possible. The enemy was bloodied and exhausted. One more push would break them, but silence the protests. You don't understand, we've already lost. Not here, not today, but eventually. Because they've learned something we never knew. They've learned to make courage contagious, and we have no defense against that. The fleet from New Harmony. The Allied fleet didn't pursue. They were too busy singing. 40 species, united not by government treaties or military alliances, but by shared understanding. They had all remembered what their ancestors knew. That courage wasn't something you found inside yourself. It was something you created together, with voices raised in harmony. On New Harmony's surface, Colonel stood among the ruins of the colony. 23,000 humans had died. The buildings were shattered. The infrastructure was destroyed. But the survivors were singing, not victory songs or celebration hymns. They were singing for the dead, songs of remembrance and honor, because the dead had held long enough for help to arrive. The dead had proven that New Appalachia wasn't luck. It was something that could be repeated anywhere humans stood together. The news spread across the galaxy faster than the retreat. The Battle of New Harmony became the second proof that the impossible was possible. Species that had lived under occupation for decades began to openly sing their war songs. Resistance movements that had been scattered and disorganized suddenly found unity in shared melodies. The galaxy was changing, one song at a time. The High Council met in emergency session. They reviewed casualty reports, strategic assessments, and psychological evaluations. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. The collective's expansion was over. They could still hold their current territories through force, but they could never conquer another system. Not when every potential enemy had learned to sing. The council debated for 3 days. Some members argued for escalation, for crushing every species that sang until fear returned to the galaxy. Others argued for negotiation, for finding a way to coexist with these new singing alliances. The arguments grew heated, then desperate, then resigned. On the 4th day, the High Council issued an official statement. It was broadcast to every species in the galaxy. The statement was remarkably short. The collective acknowledges that continued military expansion is no longer viable. We recognize that certain species have developed cultural practices that make them impossible to defeat through conventional warfare. We hereby declare a cessation of all offensive military operations and open ourselves to diplomatic negotiations with any species willing to engage in peaceful discourse. The statement carefully avoided saying what everyone knew. They were surrendering, not because they had lost territory or ships. They were surrendering because they had finally understood what they were fighting. They weren't fighting armies or fleets. They were fighting the idea that courage could be shared, that hope could be weaponized, that ancient songs held power no modern weapon could match. Humanity's role in this transformation was both central and deliberately understated. Human diplomats worked to ensure that credit was shared among all the species who had rediscovered their war songs. Yes, humans had held New Appalachia. Yes, humans had held New Harmony, but they had rammed their ships into battleships while singing death chants. They had rediscovered their swarm ceremonies. 40 species had come to New Harmony's defense, each bringing their own traditions, their own songs, their own courage. Dr. Sarah was invited to speak at the first Galactic Council meeting after the surrender. She stood before representatives of 200 species and chose her words carefully. Humanity didn't invent the idea of singing before battle. We just remembered it at the right time. Every species in this chamber has ancestors who understood what we're learning now. Courage isn't something you're born with. It's something you create together, through shared purpose and shared voice. She paused, looking around the chamber. They conquered you by making you forget this. They banned your war songs, suppressed your ceremonies, eliminated your traditions. They turned warfare into mathematics where numbers always won. But mathematics can't account for beings who have learned to stop caring about the odds. I stood up. Are you saying we should prepare for constant war, that we should teach every generation to sing their way into battle? Sarah shook her head. No, I'm saying you should remember that you can. They surrendered not because we beat them in battle, but because they realized they could never make you forget again. Once you know that singing together makes you unbreakable, once you've passed that knowledge to your children, no empire can conquer you through fear alone. The chamber erupted in discussion. Some species were excited about reclaiming their cultural heritage. Others were worried about militarizing their populations. A few questioned whether this focus on war songs would lead to more conflict rather than less. The debates would continue for years. But something had fundamentally changed in the galaxy. The collective had spent decades proving that overwhelming force could conquer any species. Then 5,000 humans on New Appalachia had disproven that with songs. Then 80,000 humans and civilians on New Harmony had done it again. Then 40 species had learned the same lesson and spread it to 80 more. The galaxy had learned that courage wasn't individual, it was collective. And once enough beings understood that, the mathematics of warfare stopped making sense. You couldn't calculate the breaking point of soldiers who sang themselves into fearlessness. You couldn't predict when an outnumbered force would suddenly become unbeatable because they had found the right song. Humanity's legacy wasn't empire or dominance. It was memory. They had reminded the galaxy of something ancient and powerful. They had shown that the old ways, the songs and ceremonies and shared rituals, weren't primitive superstitions. They were technologies for turning individuals into something greater, for transforming fear into purpose, for making the impossible routine. In the years that followed, anthropologists from dozens of species studied Earth's military history. They learned about warriors singing hymns before charging into battle. They studied Maori and Viking war songs. They analyzed the psychology of military marches and cadences. They discovered that humanity had never completely abandoned these practices, had never fully embraced the cold mathematics of modern warfare. Other species began rediscovering their own traditions with new appreciation. They established academies to teach their death chants to young warriors. They rebuilt their ceremonial chambers for swarm mind synchronization. The who had no tradition of war songs developed new ones based on their own cultural values and martial philosophy. The collective watched these developments from behind their borders. They had retreated to their core systems, their military still powerful but their will to expand broken. Some tried to understand what had defeated them. They studied the recordings of human battle hymns, analyzed the psychological effects, even attempted to create their own war songs. But they discovered something that every other species already knew. You couldn't calculate your way to courage. You couldn't logic yourself into fearlessness. The songs worked because they connected beings to something larger than individual survival. They worked because they made dying for your comrades feel more important than living alone. The who had built an empire on rational calculation couldn't fake that kind of connection. On New Appalachia, a memorial was built for the 800 soldiers who had held against 200,000 troops. The memorial was simple: a stone wall with 800 names carved into it, and beneath the names, a single line. They sang, and the song made them giants. On New Harmony, a larger memorial honored the 23,000 dead. The monument featured 40 pillars, one for each species that had come to the colony's defense. On each pillar was written a line from that species' war song, translated into every galactic language. Visitors walked among the pillars and heard the songs playing softly, a reminder of what those people had defended. But the real memorial wasn't made of stone or metal. It was carried in the voices of 1 billion beings across 100 worlds. Children learned war songs before they learned mathematics. Soldiers sang together before every deployment, not because they expected battle, but because they wanted to remember they could face it together if needed. Civilians sang at gatherings, keeping the traditions alive even in peacetime. The galaxy had learned that songs were more than entertainment or cultural expression. They were weapons that no armor could stop, shields that no force could break, and bonds that no distance could sever. When you sang with your comrades, you became part of something that transcended individual life and death. You became the song itself, and the song would continue long after you fell silent. Humanity never claimed to have saved the galaxy, but they had done something equally important. They had reminded everyone else how to save themselves, and in doing so, They had ensured that no empire built on fear and overwhelming force could ever conquer the galaxy again. Because now, everywhere you looked, beings were singing. And as long as the songs continued, courage would never be in short supply.